had a heart attack and fell down the stairs. I was rushed to the hospital. The doctors desperately tried to reach my son and his wife. She answered, "We're on vacation. Don't bother us." When I came home, I found them showing my house to buyers. But when I said 3 words, panic. "I'm glad to have you here, Ad." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The pain hit me like a freight train at 3:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on my nightstand when my chest exploded in agony. At 61, I thought I knew what pain felt like. I'd worked construction for 30 years, broken ribs, torn muscles, herniated discs, but this was different. This was my body declaring war on itself. I tried to call out for help, but Leonard and Melissa had moved out months ago into their own place across town. The house felt enormous and empty as I stumbled toward the stairs, each step a monumental effort. My left arm had gone completely numb, and sweat poured down my face despite the December chill. That's when I fell. The wooden stairs that I'd climbed thousands of times suddenly became my enemy. My foot caught the edge of the second step, and gravity took over. I tumbled down 14 steps, my body hitting each one with a sickening thud. The last thing I remember was my head connecting with the hardwood floor at the bottom, the taste of blood filling my mouth. Mrs. Henderson from next door found me 6 hours later when she came to borrow sugar for her morning coffee. She'd been doing that for 3 years since her husband died, and I'd always suspected she just wanted company. Thank God for her routine. The paramedics said if she'd found me even an hour later, I wouldn't have made it. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and voices I couldn't quite understand. Someone kept asking me questions, but my mouth wouldn't work properly. I tried to tell them about Leonard, my son, but the words came out as mumbles. Everything felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. St. Mary's Hospital became my world for the next 7 days. The ICU was a sterile prison of beeping machines and antiseptic smells. Tubes ran in and out of my body like I was some kind of science experiment. The doctors told me later that I'd had what they called a massive myocardial infarction. In plain English, my heart had nearly given up on me completely. Dr. Martinez, a kind woman with tired eyes, tried repeatedly to reach Leonard. I watched her make call after call from my bed, her frustration growing with each attempt. She'd dial the number I'd given her, wait, then hang up with a slight shake of her head. On the 3rd day, she finally got through. I was drifting in and out of consciousness, but I heard every word of that conversation. Dr. Martinez explained the situation carefully, professionally. She told whoever answered that I'd suffered a severe heart attack, that I was in critical condition, that family should come immediately. The response still echoes in my mind. "We're on vacation in Cabo. This is really inconvenient timing. Can't this wait until we get back next week?" Patrick's always been dramatic about his health. I recognized Melissa's voice immediately. My daughter-in-law of 8 years, the woman I'd welcomed into our family, the woman I'd helped buy her first car, the woman who'd convinced Leonard to name their future children after me. She was dismissing my near-death experience like I'd called to complain about a leaky faucet. Dr. Martinez tried again, her voice more urgent. "Ma'am, I need you to understand. Your father-in-law is in the ICU. His condition is extremely serious. We nearly lost him twice in the first 24 hours. Look, doctor, we paid $15,000 for this vacation. Non-refundable. Patrick will understand. He's tough as nails. Just keep him comfortable until we get back. Don't bother calling again unless he actually dies." The line went dead. I lay there in that hospital bed, machines keeping me alive, and felt something die inside me that had nothing to do with my heart. The woman I'd trusted, the woman who called me Papa Patrick and brought me homemade cookies every Sunday, had just written me off. Worse, I could hear Leonard in the background, not protesting, not demanding they come home, just silent. Dr. Martinez stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone. When she noticed my eyes were open, she tried to smile, but I could see the disgust in her expression. "I'm sure they're just in shock," she said, but we both knew that was a lie. The nurses were angels. Janet, a grandmother of 5, held my hand during the worst moments. Maria brought me ice chips when my mouth felt like sandpaper. They never asked about my family after that first day, but I caught them whispering sometimes, shaking their heads. I wasn't the first elderly patient they'd seen abandoned by family, and I wouldn't be the last. By day 5, I was stable enough to think clearly. And that's when the real pain started. Not physical pain, the medication handled most of that. This was the pain of understanding that the people I'd devoted my life to protecting and providing for had abandoned me in my darkest hour. Leonard, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his mother died when he was 12, hadn't even tried to call. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made. Working double shifts to pay for his college education while I lived on ramen noodles, giving him and Melissa $25,000 for their wedding when I had to take out a second mortgage, watching their dog every weekend so they could go out and have fun as a young couple, fixing their car, their plumbing, their problems. Always their problems. The worst part was remembering the conversation I'd overheard 2 months ago. I'd gone to their house to drop off some of my late wife's jewelry that I thought Melissa might want. The front door was unlocked, so I'd walked in, calling out to announce myself. That's when I heard them in the kitchen. "I swear, Leonard, your father is going to live forever just to spite us," Melissa had said. "Do you know how much that house is worth? We could pay off all our debt and buy something nice with what's left over." "Don't talk like that," Leonard had replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad's still healthy. Healthy and stubborn. He needs to be in a nursing home anyway. That house is too big for one person. It's wasteful." I'd left quietly that day, the jewelry box still in my hands, my heart heavy with the knowledge that my own family was waiting for me to die. But even then, I'd made excuses for them. Young people say thoughtless things. They didn't really mean it. Lying in that ICU bed listening to machines keep me alive while my family enjoyed margaritas on a beach, I finally understood that they'd meant every word. On the 7th day, Dr. Martinez gave me the news I'd been hoping for. My heart was stable enough for me to go home. The damage was significant, but with medication and lifestyle changes, I could expect to live several more years. As she spoke, I made a decision that would change everything. If Leonard and Melissa thought I was already dead to them, maybe it was time to show them what that actually looked like. Mrs. Henderson drove me home from the hospital in her ancient Buick, fussing over me like a mother hen. She'd visited me every day during my stay, bringing magazines and homemade soup that the nurses had to turn away because of my restricted diet. At 73, she had more maternal instinct in her little finger than my own daughter-in-law had in her entire body. "You sure you don't want me to stay?" she asked for the 5th time as we pulled into my driveway. "I can make you some tea, help you get settled." I squeezed her weathered hand gently. "You've done more than enough, Eleanor. I just need to rest." What I really needed was to be alone with my thoughts and figure out how to process what my family had done to me. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Same blue shutters I'd painted last spring, same flower beds that Margaret had planted before she died, same home that had sheltered 3 generations of my family. But as I fumbled with my keys at the front door, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the morning newspaper was sitting perfectly on the porch, as if someone had been maintaining appearances. Maybe it was the faint sound of voices coming from inside. Or maybe it was just the instinct that comes from living in the same place for 32 years and knowing when something doesn't belong. I opened the door as quietly as possible, my heart racing for entirely different reasons now. The voices became clearer as I stepped into the entryway, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "The master bedroom has incredible natural light," a woman's voice was saying, "and this hardwood flooring is original to the house, 1952. They don't make quality like this anymore." I recognized that voice, Melissa, but she was supposed to be in Cabo for another 3 days. "The square footage is exactly what we're looking for," a man replied. "What did you say the asking price was again?" My legs nearly gave out. Asking price? I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, and crept toward the living room where the voices were coming from. "We're asking $350,000, Leonard's voice answered. "I know it seems high, but this neighborhood is about to explode in value. The city's planning a new shopping complex just 2 miles away. $350,000. They were selling my house. My house. While I was fighting for my life in the ICU, they'd put my home on the market. I peered around the corner and saw them. Leonard stood near the fireplace wearing a black suit I'd never seen before, his face bearing an expression of forced solemnity. Melissa was dressed entirely in black as well, a tissue dabbing at perfectly dry eyes. Between them stood a middle-aged couple, the potential buyers, examining my living room like they were already measuring it for their furniture. "The estate sale will be next weekend," Melissa was saying, her voice catching just enough to sound believable. We just can't bear to keep Papa's things. Too many memories, you understand. Estate sale. Papa's things. She was talking about me in the past tense. The woman buyer nodded sympathetically. How long ago did you lose him? Just over a week, Leonard replied, his voice steady. Massive heart attack. Very sudden. At least he didn't suffer long. I had to grip the door frame to keep from falling over. They weren't just selling my house. They were telling people I was dead. These strangers were touring my home, planning their lives in my space, while my son and daughter-in-law played the grieving survivors. Was he sick for long? The mail buyer asked. Melissa dabbed at her eyes again. Papa Patrick was such a strong man, worked in construction his whole life, but his heart? The doctor said it was just his time. He went peacefully in his sleep, not alone on the floor after falling down the stairs, not hooked up to machines while they sipped cocktails on a beach, peacefully in his sleep. Like some fairy tale ending. We're so sorry for your loss, the woman said. Losing a parent is never easy. He was more than a father-in-law to me, Melissa replied, and I could hear the practiced grief in her tone. He was like my own dad. We lived here with him for the past 2 years, taking care of him. When Leonard inherited the house, we just knew we couldn't stay. Too many ghosts. 2 years. They'd never lived here with me. They'd visited for dinner occasionally, usually when they needed money or wanted me to fix something. But Melissa was spinning a story of devoted caregivers, sacrificing their youth to tend to an aging patriarch. The house has been well maintained, Leonard added. I made sure Dad had the roof redone just last year, and the furnace is only 3 years old. You won't have any major expenses for quite a while. I had paid for that roof. $12,000 I'd saved for years to keep the house in good condition. And the furnace, another $4,000 I'd scraped together after the old one died during a bitter January cold snap. Leonard had helped with neither expense, despite my hints that his inheritance would benefit from maintaining the property. The buyers walked through my living room, admiring the built-in bookshelves I'd constructed myself, running their hands along the mantelpiece where photographs of 3 generations of my family sat. Photos that included Leonard as a baby, as a graduate, as a groom. Photos that told the story of a life lived and a family loved. When would you need us to close? The man asked. As soon as possible, Melissa replied quickly. We've already purchased our new home, and frankly, staying here is just too painful. Every room holds memories. Our new home. They'd already bought another house with money they didn't have, banking on my death and their lies to make it all work. The audacity was breathtaking. We can have the paperwork ready by Monday, the woman said. Would that work for you? That would be perfect, Leonard nodded. We really appreciate you folks understanding our situation. It's been such a difficult time. I watched my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked down the aisle at his wedding, shake hands with strangers who were buying his father's home with his father's money while his father was supposedly dead. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I almost admired its thoroughness. As the buyers headed toward the front door, discussing financing and inspection dates, I slipped back toward the entryway. I needed to get out before they saw me, needed time to process what I'd witnessed. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard Melissa's voice one more time. Oh, and just so you know, we've already cleaned out most of Papa's personal items, donated his clothes to charity, sold his tools to a neighbor. We kept a few family photos for Leonard, but everything else had to go. It was just too hard to look at his things every day. My tools. The craftsman said I'd built my career with. The wrenches and saws that had put food on our table and Leonard through college. Gone. Given away like they were worthless junk instead of the instruments that had built our life. I made it outside just as they opened the front door to see the buyers off. I crouched behind Mrs. Henderson's hedge, watching as my son and daughter-in-law played their parts perfectly, accepting condolences and promising to keep in touch about the closing. After the buyers drove away, Leonard and Melissa stood in my driveway for a moment, dropping their bereaved act like a costume they no longer needed. That went well, Melissa said, checking her phone. They'll pay asking price, no negotiation. We should clear almost $300,000 after the realtor's fee. Are you sure about this? Leonard asked, and for a moment I thought I heard doubt in his voice. I mean, what if someone finds out he's not actually dead? Melissa laughed, the sound sharp and cold. Who's going to tell them? The hospital thinks we're out of town. We haven't talked to his friends in months. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll have the money and be long gone. But what if he comes home? From where? Melissa's voice turned hard. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. His sister lives 3 states away and they barely talk. He'll come crawling back, and when he does, we'll deal with it then. Worst case, we tell him we were trying to help with his medical bills. Leonard nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in his posture. I just keep thinking about what happens when people find out we lied. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Melissa replied, already walking toward their car. Besides, at his age, with his health problems, how long is he really going to last anyway? We're just speeding up the inevitable. I watched them drive away in the car I'd helped them buy, leaving me crouched behind a neighbor's hedge, officially dead according to their version of reality. The afternoon sun felt cold against my face as I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, not from my recent hospitalization, but from the magnitude of what I'd discovered. They hadn't just abandoned me in my moment of need. They'd killed me off entirely, erased me from my own life, and were profiting from my fictional death. The house where I'd planned to live out my remaining years was sold. My possessions were scattered to the wind. My very existence had been edited out of their story, but they'd made one crucial mistake. I wasn't dead, and I had no intention of staying that way. I spent 2 hours sitting in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted like sawdust and trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. She kept shooting me worried glances over her reading glasses, clearly sensing that something was wrong but too polite to pry. Every few minutes she'd offer me another cookie or suggest I lie down, but food was the last thing on my mind. My house was sold. My belongings were gone. According to my son and daughter-in-law, I was dead and buried. The magnitude of their betrayal sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. But underneath the hurt, something else was growing, something that felt like steel forming in my spine. "Eleanor," I finally said, setting down my untouched coffee, "I need to ask you a favor." She folded her newspaper and gave me her full attention. "Anything, Patrick. You know that. Can I borrow your car for a few hours? There's something I need to take care of." Her weathered face creased with concern. "Honey, you just got out of the hospital. Should you be driving? I can take you wherever you need to go." I shook my head gently. "This is something I need to do alone, but I promise you, I'll be careful." She studied my face for a long moment, then reached into her purse and handed me her keys. "Just promise me you'll call if you need anything. And Patrick?" She touched my arm lightly. "Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." If only she knew how alone I'd been all along. I drove to Leonard's apartment complex across town, my hands steady on the wheel despite everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as I pulled up next to their silver Honda, the car I'd co-signed for when Leonard's credit wasn't good enough. Another favor, another sacrifice that had apparently meant nothing. Their apartment was on the second floor of a generic complex that looked like 1,000 others built in the 1980s. Beige siding, brown trim, no personality. I climbed the stairs slowly, partly because of my recent heart attack, but mostly because I wanted time to prepare for what came next. I could hear them through the door before I knocked. Melissa's voice was animated, excited. "I called Jenny at the real estate office. She says we can probably close by Friday if the buyers can get their financing approved that quickly. That's 4 days, Leonard. 4 days and we're free." "Free from what?" Leonard's voice was quieter, thoughtful. "Free from Dad? He's been good to us, Melissa. He helped us get this place, helped us with the car payments when you lost your job last year. He helped us because he wanted to control us." Melissa snapped back. "Everything comes with strings attached with your father. Do this, do that. Be grateful. Remember what I've done for you. I'm tired of living under his thumb." "We're not living under his thumb. We haven't even seen him in 2 weeks. Exactly my point. He guilt trips us into visiting, into pretending we're this happy family, when really he's just a lonely old man who can't accept that his son has his own life now." I raised my hand to knock, then stopped. I wanted to hear more. "Sometimes I think you married me just to get away from him," Melissa continued. "And now look where we are. 28 years old and still dependent on Daddy's handouts. This house sale is our chance to finally be independent. By lying and telling people he's dead, it's a white lie. A temporary solution. Once we get the money and pay off our debts, we can figure out the rest later. Maybe we'll tell him we sold it to help with his medical bills. He'll probably thank us for being so thoughtful." Leonard was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was resigned. "I just hope we're doing the right thing." "We are," Melissa said firmly. "Trust me on this. Your father will be fine. He's tougher than he looks, and he's got that Social Security check coming in every month. He doesn't need a big house anymore anyway. This is better for everyone." That's when I knocked. The conversation inside stopped immediately. I heard whispering, then footsteps approaching the door. Leonard's voice came through the wood, cautious. "Who is it?" I took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "Still not dead." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came the sound of the chain lock being fumbled with, the deadbolt turning, and finally the door swinging open. Leonard stood in the doorway, his face the color of old paper. Behind him, Melissa sat frozen on their couch, a real estate contract in her hands and her mouth hanging open like she'd seen a ghost, which, in their version of reality, she had. "Dad?" Leonard's voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. But you were," the hospital said. "The hospital said I had a heart attack," I replied calmly. "They didn't say I died, though apparently you two have been spreading that story around town." Melissa shot to her feet, the contract fluttering to the floor. "Patrick! Oh my God," we thought. "The doctors couldn't reach us in Mexico, and when we got back and you weren't at the hospital, we assumed." "You assumed wrong," I said, stepping into their apartment uninvited. The space was small but nicely furnished, mostly with items I'd bought them as housewarming gifts. The coffee table where my supposed death certificate lay was one I'd built in my workshop and given them for their first anniversary. Leonard closed the door behind me, his hands shaking. "Dad, I can explain everything. When we got back from vacation and found out what happened, we panicked. We didn't know what to do. So you decided to sell my house and tell people I was dead?" I kept my voice level, conversational. "That seems like an interesting solution to panic." Melissa had recovered some of her composure and stepped forward, tears appearing in her eyes as if by magic. "Papa Patrick, you have to understand. We were devastated when we heard about your heart attack. We felt so guilty for not being there. When the hospital bill started coming in, we thought maybe selling the house would help cover your medical expenses." "Medical expenses," I repeated. "And I suppose the $300,000 you're asking for my house is all going to St. Mary's Hospital?" The tears dried up instantly. Leonard and Melissa exchanged a quick glance that told me everything I needed to know. "Well," Melissa stammered, "not all of it. We thought maybe we could use some of it to get you into a nice assisted living facility, somewhere with medical staff who could take better care of you than we could." "How thoughtful," I said. "And this assisted living facility, did you pick one out already? Or were you planning to let me know about this plan after you'd already spent my money?" Leonard found his voice again. "Dad, we weren't trying to hurt you. We just thought." "You thought I was dead," I finished for him. "Or at least you hoped I was. Tell me, son, when exactly did you plan to hold my funeral? Before or after you cashed the check from my house?" The apartment fell silent except for the hum of their refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. I looked around the space that I'd helped them afford, at the life I'd helped them build, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "I heard your conversation with the buyers," I continued, "about how you'd been living with me for 2 years, taking care of me and my declining health, about how painful it was to keep my belongings around, about how you'd already donated my clothes and sold my tools." Melissa's face went pale. "Patrick, we can explain. Can you?" I asked. "Can you explain how my Craftsman tool set that I spent 30 years collecting ended up at a pawn shop while I was fighting for my life? Can you explain how you managed to clean out my house and put it on the market in the 7 days I was unconscious?" Leonard slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "We messed up, Dad. We messed up really bad." "No," I said quietly. "You didn't mess up. You planned this. This wasn't panic or grief or confusion. This was calculated. You saw an opportunity and you took it." Melissa tried one more time. "We love you, Papa Patrick. Everything we did was because we were trying to help." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd called me family for 8 years, who'd sat at my dinner table every Sunday, who'd cried at my wife's funeral and promised to take care of me in my old age. "If this is how you help people you love," I said, "I'd hate to see what you do to people you don't like." I turned toward the door, then stopped. "Oh, and one more thing. You might want to call those buyers and tell them the deal's off, because I'm very much alive and I'm very much still the owner of that house." "Dad, wait," Leonard called after me. "We can work this out. We can fix this." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Some things can't be fixed, Leonard. Some things once broken stay broken forever." As I walked down the stairs toward Mrs. Henderson's car, I could hear them arguing through their thin walls. Melissa's voice was sharp and angry, Leonard's defensive and weak. But I didn't slow down to listen. I had heard enough of their lies to last a lifetime. The drive back to Eleanor's house gave me time to think about what came next. They knew I was alive now, which meant they'd have to scramble to undo their lies. The buyers would find out they'd been deceived. The real estate agent would ask uncomfortable questions. Leonard and Melissa would have to explain how they'd managed to sell a house they didn't own on behalf of a man who wasn't dead. But that was just the beginning, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I'd been planning for this possibility for years. Ever since Margaret died and left me alone with a son who visited out of obligation, and a daughter-in-law who smiled to my face and calculated my worth behind my back. I had secrets of my own, and tomorrow I was going to start using them. The call came at 6:30 the next morning. I was sitting in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, watching the sunrise through her lace curtains and nursing my second cup of coffee when my phone rang. Leonard's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, son." His voice was strained, exhausted. "Dad, we need to talk. Can you come over, please?" "I think we talked enough yesterday," I replied calmly. "Besides, I'm sure you're busy explaining to your real estate agent why the house you were selling suddenly isn't available anymore." A long pause. "That's what we need to talk about. Dad, we're in serious trouble." "We?" I asked. "This sounds like a you problem, Leonard." "Please," he said, and I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a child. Genuine fear. "Just give us one more chance to explain. There are things you don't understand." Against my better judgment, I found myself curious about what new story they'd concocted. "Fine, but we do this on my terms. Meet me at Denny's on 5th Street in an hour. And Leonard, come alone." "But Melissa." "Melissa has done enough talking for one lifetime, just you and me." I arrived at Denny's 15 minutes early and chose a booth in the back corner where we could have privacy. The breakfast crowd was light for a Tuesday morning. Just a few construction workers and elderly couples sharing coffee and newspapers. Normal people living normal lives, not orchestrating elaborate deceptions involving fake deaths and stolen houses. Leonard walked in looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was uncombed, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his 34 years. He spotted me immediately and made his way over, sliding into the booth across from me with the heavy movements of a man carrying too much weight. "You look terrible," I observed. He managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Dad. You always know just what to say." The waitress came over and took our orders. Leonard asked for coffee and nothing else. I ordered eggs and bacon, partly because I was hungry, and partly because I wanted him to know that his crisis wasn't affecting my appetite. After she left, we sat in silence for several moments. Leonard stared at his hands, working up the courage to speak. Finally, he looked up and met my eyes. "We're broke, Dad. Completely broke." I raised an eyebrow. "Broke how? You both have jobs." "Had jobs," he corrected. "Melissa got laid off 6 months ago when the marketing firm downsized. I lost mine 3 weeks ago when the construction company I was working for went under. We've been living on credit cards and prayers ever since." This was news to me. The last time we'd talked, Leonard had been enthusiastic about his job, talking about possible promotions and pay raises. "Why didn't you tell me?" He laughed bitterly. "And admit that the son you put through college couldn't keep a job, that the man you taught to work with his hands was failing at the very thing you'd succeeded at for 30 years. I was ashamed, Dad, embarrassed. The waitress brought our food, and I took a bite of eggs while Leonard continued talking. It gets worse. Remember that vacation to Cabo you thought we were on when you had your heart attack? We weren't in Mexico. We were at a casino in Atlantic City, trying to win enough money to pay our rent." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "You were gambling?" Melissa said she had a system. She'd been watching poker tournaments on TV and thought she could read people's tells. "We took our last $1,500 and drove to New Jersey, and lost it all. Lost that and more. They were offering credit to anyone with a valid driver's license. By the time we left, we owed the casino $12,000. They gave us 60 days to pay up." I set down my fork and leaned back in the booth. The pieces of their desperation were starting to fall into place. "So, when I had my heart attack, you saw an opportunity." Leonard nodded miserably. "Melissa said if you died, I'd inherit the house. We could sell it, pay our debts, and start over somewhere else. When the hospital called and said you were in critical condition, she said maybe it was a blessing in disguise." And when I didn't die fast enough for your convenience, you decided to help the process along. We never wanted you to actually die, Leonard protested. We just thought, if people believed you were dead for a little while, we could sell the house and figure everything else out later. Melissa said we could claim it was a misunderstanding once we had the money. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and tried to find some trace of the boy who used to help me build birdhouses in the garage. And you went along with this plan because why? Because you trusted Melissa's judgment? His face reddened. Because I was desperate, Dad. Because I didn't know what else to do. Because I was scared. Scared of what? Asking your father for help? Working an honest job? Living within your means? Scared of disappointing you more than I already had. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw past the lies and schemes to the little boy who used to cry when he brought home bad grades, who worried constantly about letting me down after his mother died. So you decided that faking my death and stealing my house would disappoint me less than admitting you needed help? Leonard buried his face in his hands. It sounds insane when you put it like that. It sounds insane because it is insane, Leonard. Normal people don't solve their problems by declaring their parents dead. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What are we going to do, Dad? The casino wants their money by next Friday. If we don't pay, they said they'd send collectors. Melissa's scared to leave the apartment. I took another bite of eggs, chewing slowly while I considered his question. What are you going to do? That's the real question here. What is Leonard Holloway, grown man, an independent adult, going to do about the mess he's created? I don't know, he whispered. I honestly don't know. Well, here's what you're not going to do, I said, leaning forward. You're not going to sell my house. You're not going to tell any more lies about my death. And you're not going to expect me to bail you out of a problem you created with your own greed and stupidity. Leonard's face went pale. But Dad, if I don't pay the casino, then you'll face the consequences of your choices, just like a real adult. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope I'd brought with me. Leonard watched nervously as I opened it and spread several documents across the table between us. Do you know what these are? I asked. He squinted at the papers, trying to read them upside down. Legal documents? Very good. These are copies of papers I filed with my attorney 18 months ago. Right around the time I noticed Melissa asking a lot of questions about the value of my house and when I planned to update my will. Leonard's breathing grew shallow. What kind of papers? I picked up the top document and turned it so he could read it properly. This is a quitclaim deed. It transfers ownership of my house from me to someone else, effective immediately upon my death or incapacitation. To me? He asked hopefully. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, son, not to you. Leonard grabbed the paper and read it frantically, his eyes moving across the legal text until he found what he was looking for. When he did, his face went completely white. Sarah, he whispered. You left the house to Aunt Sarah? Every square inch of it, I confirmed. The house, the land, the garage, even the storage shed in the backyard. It all belongs to your aunt now. But she lives in Oregon. She hasn't been here in 5 years. She'll be here Thursday, I said casually. I called her yesterday and explained the situation. She's flying in to take possession of her property and decide what to do with it. Leonard stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. You can't do this. I'm your son. I'm your only child. You were my only child, I corrected. But children don't try to sell their parents' homes while their parents are fighting for their lives in the hospital. Children don't spread lies about their parents being dead. Children don't steal their parents' belongings and pawn them for gambling money. We didn't pawn your tools for gambling money, Leonard protested weakly. No? Then where did the extra money come from for your casino trip? Because according to what you just told me, you were already broke before you left town. Leonard slumped in his seat, caught in another lie. Melissa said it was just a loan, that we'd buy them back after we won at the casino. I picked up another document from the stack. This is a copy of the sales receipt from Mike's pawn shop on Elm Street. One Craftsman tool set, complete with workbench and storage cabinet. Sold for $800 3 weeks ago. The signature on the receipt says Leonard Holloway. He couldn't meet my eyes. Dad, I can explain. No more explanations, I said firmly. No more lies. No more excuses. You made your choices, Leonard. You chose Melissa over me. You chose gambling over honesty. You chose greed over family. Now you get to live with those choices. I gathered up the papers and slid them back into the envelope. Sarah will be contacting you about retrieving any personal items you might have left in the house. She's being generous and giving you until Sunday to collect them. After that, anything left behind becomes her property. Leonard looked like he was about to cry. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? I don't know, I said, standing up from the booth. But I suggest you figure it out quickly. And Leonard, next time you decide to fake someone's death for money, make sure they're actually dead first. I left him sitting there in that Denny's booth, staring at the ruins of his plan and the consequences of his choices. As I walked to Mrs. Henderson's car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt free. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I stayed with Mrs. Henderson, sleeping in her guest room that smelled like lavender and old books, eating her homemade soup, and trying to process the magnitude of what my family had done to me. She didn't ask questions. Bless her heart, just puttered around the house, humming old songs and making sure I took my heart medication on schedule. But my mind wouldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leonard's face in that Denny's booth, the moment he realized that his inheritance had vanished like smoke. Part of me, the part that had rocked him to sleep when he had nightmares and taught him to tie his shoes, felt guilty for the devastation I'd caused. But a larger part, the part that had been slowly breaking under years of manipulation and neglect, felt vindicated. Sarah called Wednesday evening while I was helping Eleanor with her crossword puzzle. My sister's voice was warm but tired, colored by the 3-hour time difference and a day of travel preparations.
Patrick, honey, I'm so sorry about everything you've been through, she said. I can't believe Leonard and that woman would do something so awful. I'm still trying to process it myself, I admitted, stepping out onto Eleanor's back porch for privacy. Are you sure you want to get involved in this mess? It's going to be complicated.
Sarah laughed, the same laugh that had gotten us both in trouble as children. Complicated? Patrick, I've been dealing with complicated my whole life. Besides, someone needs to teach those two that actions have consequences. They're going to fight this, you know, Melissa especially. She's not going to give up easily. Let them fight. The paperwork is all legal and filed properly. Your attorney did good work. They can be as angry as they want, but the law is the law. After we hung up, I sat on Eleanor's porch swing, listening to the evening sounds of suburbia. Somewhere nearby, a dog was barking, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt very far away from the chaos my life had become. Thursday morning brought Sarah to my doorstep at exactly 9 o'clock. Rolling a small suitcase behind her and wearing the same determined expression she'd worn as a child when she decided to climb the old oak tree in our backyard. At 57, my younger sister had grown into a formidable woman, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the no-nonsense attitude of someone who'd raised 3 kids and buried a husband. "You look like hell, big brother," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "Good to see you too," I replied, breathing in her familiar scent of vanilla perfume and determination. Eleanor insisted on making us breakfast before we headed to my house, fussing over Sarah like she was visiting royalty. The two women hit it off immediately, bonding over stories of stubborn men and ungrateful children. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to them chat and feeling more peaceful than I had in months. "Your brother's always been too generous for his own good," Eleanor told Sarah while flipping pancakes. "That boy of his has been taking advantage for years." "Leonard wasn't always like this," I said, feeling the need to defend my son despite everything. "He was a good kid, helpful, respectful. Something changed after he married Melissa." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Something changed or something was revealed? Sometimes people don't change, Patrick. Sometimes they just stop hiding who they really are. The 3 of us drove to my house in Eleanor's Buick, Sarah in the passenger seat, and me in the back like a child being chauffeured to school. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange mix of homecoming and violation. This was my house, the place where I'd lived for 32 years, but it felt foreign now, tainted by Leonard and Melissa's lies. "It's lovely," Sarah said, studying the blue shutters and flower beds. "Margaret always did have good taste. She planted those roses the year before she died," I said, pointing to a climbing rose bush by the front door.
said she wanted something beautiful to welcome people home. Well, today they're welcoming the rightful owner, Sarah replied, squaring her shoulders. Let's go inside and see what kind of mess we're dealing with. I used my key to open the front door, and we stepped into the house together. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Gone was the familiar scent of coffee and wood polish, replaced by something chemical and sharp. Air freshener, I realized. They'd been trying to mask the scent of home with something artificial. The living room looked smaller somehow, emptier despite most of the furniture still being in place. Then I realized why. All the personal touches were gone. The family photos that had lined the mantelpiece, the small decorations Margaret had collected over the years, the throw pillows she'd sewn by hand. Everything that made the house feel like home had been removed. They really did clean house, Sarah observed, running her finger along the empty mantelpiece. How thorough of them. We moved through the rooms systematically, documenting what was missing and what remained. My bedroom had been stripped of everything personal. Margaret's jewelry box was gone from the dresser, along with the framed wedding photo that had sat beside it for 23 years. Even the quilt Margaret's mother had made us was missing from the bed. The kitchen was perhaps the most painful. Margaret's recipe box, the one she'd inherited from her own mother and added to for 40 years, was nowhere to be found. Her cast-iron skillet, seasoned with decades of family meals, had vanished. The coffee mug she'd bought me for Father's Day 15 years ago, the one with "World's Best Dad" printed in fading letters, was gone. They took everything that mattered, I said, standing in the middle of the kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 3 decades. Everything that had meaning. Sarah put her hand on my shoulder. Things can be replaced, Patrick. What matters is that you're here to replace them. We were in the basement, checking to see if any of my tools had survived the great sell-off when we heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the small basement window, I could see Leonard and Melissa getting out of their Honda, both of them looking grim and determined. "Showtime," Sarah murmured. We climbed the stairs to meet them at the front door. Leonard had his key ready, but Sarah intercepted him on the porch. "I'm sorry, but you don't live here anymore," she said pleasantly. "You'll need to knock like any other visitor." Leonard looked confused. "Who are you?" "I'm Sarah Holloway Morrison, Patrick's sister. And as of Tuesday morning, I'm the legal owner of this property." She held up the deed. "So I'm going to need you to put that key away and explain what you're doing here." Melissa pushed past Leonard, her face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. Patrick can't just give his house away to spite us. Leonard is his son. He has rights." "Actually, he doesn't," Sarah replied calmly. "Patrick is the rightful owner of this property, and he can dispose of it however he sees fit." Which he did, legally and properly. "We're not leaving," Melissa declared, crossing her arms. "This is our home too. We've lived here for 2 years taking care of Patrick. We have tenant rights." I stepped forward from behind Sarah. "You've never lived here, Melissa. Not for 2 years, not for 2 weeks. That was just another lie you told the buyers." Leonard finally found his voice. "Dad, please, can we talk about this? As a family?" "Family." I repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what we are?" "Because families don't usually try to sell each other's houses while pretending each other are dead." "We made a mistake," Leonard said desperately. "A huge mistake. But we can fix this. We can make it right." "Some things can't be fixed," I replied, echoing the words I'd said in their apartment. "Some betrayals are too deep." Melissa's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this to us. We have nowhere to go. The casino is going to send people after us if we don't pay them by tomorrow." "Then I suggest you figure out a solution," Sarah said unsympathetically, "because this house isn't it." "We could call the police," Melissa threatened. "Tell them you're trying to steal Leonard's inheritance." Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Please do. I'd love to explain to the officers how you two were selling a house you didn't own on behalf of a man you claimed was dead. I'm sure they'd find that very interesting." Leonard grabbed Melissa's arm. "Stop, just stop. We lost. Okay? We lost everything." For a moment, looking at my son's defeated face, I felt a flicker of the old paternal instinct. The urge to fix his problems, to make everything better, to sacrifice my own needs for his happiness. But then I remembered lying in that hospital bed, listening to Melissa dismiss my near-death as an inconvenience. I remembered finding them selling my house, dividing up my possessions like I was already in the ground.
You didn't lose everything, Leonard, I said quietly. You threw it away. There's a difference. Melissa made one last desperate attempt. What about forgiveness? What about second chances? Isn't that what family is supposed to be about? I looked at this woman who had called me Papa Patrick, who had sat at my dinner table and accepted my generosity while planning my fictional funeral. Forgiveness has to be earned, Melissa, and second chances are for people who deserve them. So that's it? Leonard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. After 34 years, you're just done with me? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of relationship. I thought about the little boy who used to help me build things in the garage, who would fall asleep on my shoulder while we watched baseball games, who cried when his goldfish died and made me promise we'd see it again in heaven. But that little boy was gone, replaced by a man who would sell his father's home and scatter his father's memories for gambling money and a fresh start. I'm done with who you've become, I said finally. The Leonard I raised, the Leonard I loved, would never have done what you did. I don't know who you are anymore. Melissa grabbed Leonard's arm and started pulling him toward their car. Come on, there's nothing left for us here. Leonard resisted for a moment, looking back at me with an expression of pure loss. Dad, Goodbye, Leonard. He let Melissa lead him away then, and I watched from my porch as they drove out of my life. The finality of it should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt like I'd been carrying a heavy weight for years and had finally been allowed to set it down. Sarah put her arm around my shoulders as their car disappeared around the corner. You did the right thing, Patrick. Then why doesn't it feel right? Because you're a good man who loved his son, she said gently. But love isn't enough when it's not returned. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. We stood there on the porch for a long time, watching the afternoon shadows grow longer across the lawn. The house behind us was empty of everything that had made it home, but it was mine again, free of lies, free of manipulation, free of people who saw me as nothing more than a meal ticket and an inheritance. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely in my own home. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Sarah's house in Portland, Oregon, watching my sister teach her youngest granddaughter how to make pancakes from scratch. The morning sun streamed through windows that overlooked a garden bursting with vegetables and flowers, and the air smelled like coffee and possibility instead of regret and disappointment. Grandpa Patrick, you're burning the bacon, 8-year-old Emma informed me with the serious tone that only children can master. I looked down at the skillet and laughed, quickly flipping the strips before they turned to charcoal. Good catch, sweetheart. Your Grandma Sarah would never forgive me if I ruined breakfast. She forgives you for everything, Emma replied matter-of-factly. She says you're still learning how to be happy, out of the mouths of babes. Sarah caught my eye from across the kitchen and smiled, flour dusting her apron and contentment radiating from every line of her face. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Warm, accepting, built on genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. The decision to sell my house and move to Oregon hadn't been easy, but it had been right. Sarah and I had spent 2 weeks cleaning out 32 years of memories, sorting through what to keep, what to donate, and what to simply let go. She'd helped me pack Margaret's things with the same gentle care she'd shown when we were children, and I'd scraped my knee or lost a beloved toy. The house had sold quickly to a young couple with 2 small children, people who saw it as a home rather than an investment or an inheritance. I'd watched from Sarah's rental car as they walked through the rooms with their real estate agent, the husband pointing out where they'd put a swing set, the wife planting flower gardens in the same spots where Margaret had once grown her roses. They'll be happy here, Sarah had said, squeezing my hand as we drove away for the last time. I hope so. It's a house that deserves happiness. The money from the sale had been more than enough to buy a small cottage 3 blocks from Sarah's house, a place with a workshop in the garage where I could rebuild my tool collection, and a front porch where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. It wasn't the same as the house I'd shared with Margaret, but it was mine, untainted by betrayal or false promises. I hadn't heard from Leonard since that day on the porch. Sarah's lawyer had handled all the legal details of transferring the property, and we'd left forwarding addresses with the post office in case any important mail arrived. But there had been no letters, no phone calls, no attempts at reconciliation. The silence hurt sometimes, but it was a clean hurt, like the pain of a properly set bone healing. Mrs. Henderson wrote to me every few weeks. keeping me updated on neighborhood gossip and assuring me that Leonard and Melissa's apartment had been emptied shortly after our final confrontation. She'd heard through the grocery store rumor mill that they'd moved out of state, possibly to Florida, but nobody knew for certain. They'd simply vanished from the life I'd known, leaving behind only the memory of betrayal and the valuable lesson that blood relation doesn't guarantee loyalty. "Uncle Patrick, Mom wants to know if you're coming to Danny's graduation next month," called Sarah's daughter Beth from the living room. At 31, Beth was everything I'd hoped Leonard would become: responsible, caring, successful in her own right, but still connected to family. She worked as a teacher and had inherited her mother's gift for making everyone around her feel valued and heard. "Wouldn't miss it," I called back, sliding the bacon onto a paper towel-lined plate. Danny was Sarah's oldest grandchild, graduating from high school and heading to college on a partial scholarship he'd earned through his own hard work. I'd offered to help with the remaining costs, and Sarah had let me, understanding that I needed to feel useful, needed to invest in a future that appreciated the gift. The contrast with Leonard's expectations couldn't have been sharper. Danny had thanked me with tears in his eyes, promising to make me proud and pay it forward someday. Leonard had always taken my financial help as his due, never seeming to understand that generosity given freely was different from support demanded as a right. "Breakfast is ready," Sarah announced, and the family gathered around the kitchen table that had become my anchor in this new life. Sarah, Beth's husband Mike, and Emma, all of them making room for the uncle and grandfather who'd found his way home after getting lost for so many years. As we shared pancakes and bacon and conversation about everything and nothing, I felt Margaret's presence in a way I hadn't since she died. Not the sad, aching absence that had haunted me for years, but a warm approval, as if she was finally at peace knowing I'd found my way to people who truly loved me. "I got a letter yesterday," I said during a lull in the conversation. Everyone looked at me with mild curiosity. "From my doctor back home. My heart is healing better than they expected. All my numbers are good." "That's wonderful," Beth said warmly. "I told you Oregon air would be good for you, but it wasn't the Oregon air, and we all knew it. It was the absence of stress, the presence of genuine affection, the freedom from constantly wondering when the next crisis would arise or the next guilt trip would begin. My heart was healing because my life was healing." After breakfast, I helped Sarah with the dishes while the others scattered to their various weekend activities. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes between people who've known each other their whole lives and don't need constant conversation to feel connected. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked as she handed me a plate to dry. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret Leonard's choices? Yes. Did I regret the years I'd spent enabling them? Absolutely. Did I regret finally choosing myself? Not for a second. Only that it took me so long to understand the difference between loving someone and letting them destroy you, I said. Sarah nodded, rinsing soap suds from a coffee mug. "Margaret used to worry about that, you know. She'd call me sometimes when Leonard was acting up, afraid that you were too generous for your own good." This was news to me. She never said anything, because she knew you had to figure it out yourself. She said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known, but sometimes big hearts need protection from the people who would take advantage of them. I dried the mug carefully, thinking about my wife's wisdom and wishing I'd listened to her unspoken concerns, but regret was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. The past was written, unchangeable. The future was blank pages waiting to be filled with better choices. "I've been thinking about taking a woodworking class at the community center," I said, changing the subject to something more positive. "Maybe learning some new techniques." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, smiling. "Mr. Patterson down the street makes these beautiful birdhouses. I bet he'd love to have someone to talk shop with." That afternoon, I walked to my cottage and spent time in the workshop, organizing my new tools and planning projects that excited me instead of obligations that drained me. I was building a toy chest for Emma, something she could keep her treasures in and maybe pass down to her own children someday. It was the kind of project I'd once imagined making for Leonard's children, the grandchildren who would never exist because my son had chosen immediate gratification over the long-term work of building a family. As evening approached, I sat on my front porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching neighbors walk their dogs and children ride bicycles on sidewalks, free from the weight of dysfunction and disappointment. The mailman waved as he passed, a friendly gesture in a place where I was known as Sarah's brother Patrick, rather than the man whose son had tried to fake his death for money. My phone rang, and for a moment my heart jumped with the old hope that it might be Leonard, ready to apologize and rebuild our relationship. But the caller ID showed Sarah's number, and I answered with genuine pleasure instead of anxious anticipation. "Did you remember to take your evening medication?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, Mother," I replied, laughing. "All taken care of." "Good. And did you eat dinner? You can't live on bacon alone despite what you seem to think. I had a sandwich and some of those strawberries from your garden. I'm fine, Sarah, better than fine." There was a pause, then her voice became softer. "I'm proud of you, Patrick, for everything you've been through, for the choices you made, for starting over at 61. Not everyone would have had the courage." "I had good teachers," I said, looking across the street where Mr. Patterson was indeed working on a birdhouse in his driveway. "And better family than I realized." After we hung up, I sat on my porch until full darkness fell, listening to the sounds of a peaceful neighborhood and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete contentment. No worry about when the next crisis would hit. No anxiety about disappointing anyone. No guilt about setting boundaries. I thought about Leonard sometimes, wondered if he'd found a way to pay his debts and start over somewhere new. Part of me hoped he had, hoped that losing everything had taught him the same lessons it had taught me. But I no longer felt responsible for his choices or their consequences. He was a grown man who had made his decisions with full knowledge of what they might cost. The heart attack that had nearly killed me had actually saved my life by showing me who I could count on and who I couldn't. The son I'd raised had failed me when I needed him most, but the sister I'd sometimes taken for granted had opened her home and heart without hesitation. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Margaret and the conversations we'd had about legacy and what we'd leave behind. I'd once thought my legacy would be Leonard, the son I'd raised, and the values I'd tried to instill in him. But maybe my real legacy was simpler. The example of someone who'd finally learned to value himself enough to walk away from people who didn't. My new life stretched ahead of me, full of woodworking projects and family dinners, grandchildren's graduations, and quiet mornings with people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide. At 61, with a damaged heart but a healed spirit, I was finally free to discover who Patrick Holloway could be when he wasn't trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And for the first time in years, I couldn't wait to find out.